Hello everyone, welcome back as we return to the Torah and try to consider what we're doing here with these amazing and wonderful texts. We've talked about J and we've talked about the priestly tradition. Now we're back to another tradition that was considered significant during the Wellhausian era, but now has kind of grown into a great question. Is there actually an E tradition? It's a good question. And scholars differ exactly on how to address it. The majority is moving in the direction of saying E is not really a separate tradition, as it is, or something that can be distinguished by itself, but something of a tradition that's different, maybe from the J. But it's so difficult at points to differentiate between J and E that it's better to treat them together. And I agree with this on many levels, and we'll see with the example of Genesis 22. It's a great example of J and E traditions, very likely so well woven that you can't tell where one begins and the other ends. But at the same time, it's also worthwhile to point out that whatever these connections are, there are distinctions in a tradition that's worth noting that separate it from some of the conditions that we saw in the J examples. So if this is an E tradition or an emphasis on the North, it's very possible that it came after 900, after the North broke off from the South and wanted its own recollection of the tradition of Israel's story with God from a northern perspective rather than a southern perspective. In this trajectory, whereas in the J tradition God speaks in a very anthropomorphic way, engages with humanity very directly. In the E tradition, God is transcendent. God uses angels and dreams to communicate with humans. The characters are flawed, but not innately, and they can get better. And we see in some examples where Genesis 18, for example, shows Abraham in a very similar tradition to what he had done in Genesis 12, giving away his wife Sarah to a leader of another people, but does so in a less problematic way, and the story also tries to cover over some of the questions that had existed in the chapter 10 version. Whether we call them J or E or whatever we want to call them, there seem to be particular interests and different hands at work in crafting these stories. The other thing that's different about E is that the E tradition appears to have a very negative view of Aaron, whereas the priestly tradition has a very positive view of Aaron. There are other traditions within, if we call it the J-E tradition or the lay tradition, that sees Aaron very negatively and even portrays him as carrying out a disqualifying event with the golden calf episode in Exodus 32 to 34. This tradition also seems to have a concern for social laws as opposed to ritual laws. There's an incredible interest on the poor, widows, orphans, and slaves that is not seen as much in the priestly tradition. There is an interest in northern worship sites and particular prominent altars, but not a singular one. So how can we look at these in any particular way? One thing that we could do is look at Genesis 15, which talks about God's encounter with Abraham. Then look at Genesis 22. You have here another story of God giving a blessing and a covenant to Abraham. And then finally look at Genesis 17. What you're going to see in each of these is a different way of looking at the portrayals of God, the names of God, and also what exactly is the test or the assessment or the reward that is happening here. How does Abraham receive the covenant in each of these stories? In the J version, there's not really much that Abraham has to do. In Genesis 22, Abraham has to offer up his son, Isaac, and it's called a test. God tests Abraham, and Abraham receives this blessing after he completes this test. Now in chapter 17, it's not exactly a test. It is an everyday occurrence. Abraham has to circumcise himself, circumcise his household, but also maintain a certain level of righteousness from then on. Those are different forms of assessment and different ways of fulfilling God's will. Now, are they contradictory? No, but it's worthwhile to see how they are distinguished and to see that within these perspectives, the different authors or different traditions viewed God's requirement of humanity differently. When we look at the different changes, we can see that in the J tradition, there's not much required of Abraham, which makes sense if the J tradition has a negative view of humanity. Whereas in the priestly tradition, everything is required of Abraham. There's circumcision, which is a national identity issue, which would be of interest in the exile. And you also have the super transcendent view of God and the very positive view of humanity, of being made in the image of God. So the expectations align with the different traditions' view of God and the different traditions' views of humanity. The Deuteronomist tradition is slightly different. Rather than seeing the covenant as a test, a one-time test, or an everyday issue, the Deuteronomist tradition seems to want to view it as something like a marriage contract. Now, this tradition seems to have a lot of connections to Josiah's reign, and it's very possible that it's very much tied to the book of Deuteronomy, but also to Josiah's political reign and his political expansion. The book is considered to have been found, or looks a lot like the book that is found in 2 Kings 18. What is the Deuteronomist tradition about? Basically, one. If you want to think of one word, it's one that defines the Deuteronomist tradition. One place of worship, the temple in Jerusalem. One God. And those who disagree or those who worship elsewhere are executed. It is a capital offense. There is one faith, one cultural identity. And also there is a hatred, a vilification of the other. Foreigners or those who have a different view of God are not simply problematical, they are a direct and clear and present threat that must be eliminated. And all of this, in many ways, consolidates Josiah's power and benefits his expansion. One of the things that also defines this, though, is that you do have, while you have the negative emotion towards the foreigners, you have a very positive view or positive emotional expression in the relationship between God and Israel. That relationship is viewed as a marriage. And it is a marriage that you have to make day in and day out, that you are living not just checking off the boxes or in a transactional way, but loving with your whole heart, with an internal drive. And that there are blessings on those who keep the law and curses on those who break it. So the covenant, on the one hand, is composite but whole. We see traditions like Genesis 15 that present it as a promise to Abraham. He doesn't really have to do anything. In Genesis 22, that covenant is presented as a one-time test that Abraham is able to achieve through his obedience. He passes the test once, he has achieved it. The D tradition looks at how it's not just about what you do, it's how you do it and your love within that action. And the priestly tradition emphasizes national identity, right way of doing things, and also views the human being as capable of doing this. Essentially, you have four different ways of looking at this covenant, but they're all molded into one particular faith, one particular tradition, and cultural understanding. So what are the key concepts in Torah theology as we're putting this together? The first one is that the world is created with God's goodness. It is a good world with people that might have flaws because of their free will, but the world itself and the potential for human beings to achieve is good. God, the concept of revelation, God is good and wants to communicate with humanity and wants humanity to understand and fulfill God's will. Third, worship. If humanity is able to receive God's revelation, then humanity is also able to respond, and there is an appropriate way to respond, both through ethics and also with worship. And then finally, you have the relationship of the covenant. All three above point to a relationship between God and humanity. that is grounded in creation and maintains in revelation and worship. And that brings to a close this discussion on, or this presentation on the Torah.